Founded by Megan Good, the Charley Project is a website that profiles over 14,000 missing people, mainly from the United States. Named after Charles Brewster Ross, a lad who went missing back in 1874 and remained lost forever, the project focuses on those who aren't considered media-worthy and catalogues as much information as possible into one database in an effort to make their stories more public and to ensure that they're never forgotten about. Today, I thought we'd go over a few unsettling pages that I found on the site. There are some things you never want a stranger to find online. Your full name, personal email, or home address. And if there's one thing I've realised, it's that prying eyes are always trying to get a peep at that valuable information of yours. In order to keep our data safe, we need to make sure we're protected. And that's why I'm excited to be partnering with today's sponsor, Aura, the smart, simple way to stay safe online. Aura's app identifies data brokers that are exposing your personal information and automatically submits opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists. Aura monitors your emails and passwords to see if you are involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web, and gives you recommendations on what to do. Their app features a VPN, password manager, real-time credit and identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and protects your devices from malware. You may already have an app that does one of those things, but with Aura, you won't have to download and pay for a bunch of separate apps. If you sign up right now using my link, you'll get a 2-week free trial. Simply go to aura.com/lazy, or click the link in my description, or scan the QR code on screen, and let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online.
What happened to Angela is the greatest mystery which has never been solved. Here's what we know for sure. She was young, she was pregnant, and she was abducted.
Bubbly 20-year-old Angela Hammond, or as she preferred to be called, Angie, was a popular young woman who lived in Clinton, a quiet farming town in Missouri. The kind of sleepy place where danger feels a million miles away. By all accounts, Angie was beloved by everyone who knew her, though nobody loved her more than her best friend and fiancé, Rob Schaefer. The two young lovebirds were expecting their first child together, with Angie being 4 months pregnant at the time of the incident. On April 4th, 1991, Angie dropped Rob off at his home after a wiener roast in Montrose. "That was at about 10 o'clock, said Rob during an interview.
I was going to meet her back uptown as soon as my mom got home. I was watching my little brother at the time. And she called later on that night.
After cruising through town with her friend and dropping her back home, Angie called Rob from a payphone at 11:23 p.m. The phone booth was located in the parking lot of the Food Barn store on East Jefferson Street, smack bang in the center of town, and just 7 blocks from Rob's home. Angie told Rob that she was too tired to meet up, and that she was just going to go back home and take a bath instead. The couple talked on the phone for several minutes. Then, Angie mentioned that a scruffy man with long hair was now circling the parking lot in an old, dirty truck. She described him as best she could. As the pair continued talking on the phone, Angie said that the man had just parked up near the phone booth, and that he appeared to be looking around his truck with a flashlight. The shadowy figure then began using the payphone next to Angie's, but appeared to be having some trouble. Angie asked him if he needed to use her phone instead, but he said he'd try the other one again in just a minute. Hearing all of this through the receiver concerned Rob, who could detect the mounting distress in his fiancée's voice. And that concern turned to outright panic when he heard Angie's screams on the other end of the line. In the background, Rob heard the voice of a man say, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway." Rob called out to Angie through the receiver, but the call had been terminated. Without hesitation, Rob jumped into his car and drove to the food barn parking lot. But as he sped through the town, he passed a green pickup truck and heard Angie screaming his name from inside it. Throwing his car into reverse, Rob spun around and began pursuing the perp's vehicle on 2nd Street and Culvert Drive. But this car chase only lasted for about a mile. In a cruel twist of fate, Rob's transmission failed, and his car came to a slow standstill. All he could do was watch as the truck carrying his fiancée away disappeared into the blackness. "My car started dying as I was making my right turn," said Rob. "This guy turned off to the right. All I saw was his brake lights and dust." Rob managed to flag down a passing driver and begged her to follow the truck. Unfortunately, she refused, and instead drove Rob to the police station at around midnight. There, he reported what had just happened to Angie. The suspect was described as a disheveled white male between the ages of 20 and 35, wearing glasses, overalls, and a dark-coloured baseball cap. Despite a thorough search of all of the local towns by both lawmen and civilians, no trace of Angie could be found anywhere. It was clear very early on that the only hope of finding the young woman was tracing the vehicle she had been taken in. According to Rob, it was a late 60s or early 70s model, two-tone green Ford F-150. The back window was completely covered by a decoration of a fish jumping out of water. The license plates were caked in mud and unreadable. The authorities were able to identify 1,600 similar trucks registered in Missouri, but unfortunately, none of them were a match. Detectives began to believe that Rob may have fabricated the entire story. After 1 week of intensive investigation, however, he was completely ruled out as a suspect. His story held up under questioning. He passed several polygraph tests and voice stress tests, and 3 witnesses later came forward and reported seeing a suspicious man in a green truck lurking around the payphones just a few short minutes before the incident. Rob had been telling the truth. Although his car failing him at that exact moment did sound fishy to some, it was later confirmed that by suddenly throwing his car in reverse, Rob had accidentally damaged his own transmission. A completely understandable mistake given the circumstances, but one he would never forgive himself for. With Rob ruled out as a suspect, the authorities began to think that Angie may have fallen victim to a still uncaught serial killer. After some detective work, they found possible links between Angie's case and those of 2 other women in west central Missouri. On January 19th, 1991, 3 months before Angie was taken, 42-year-old Trudy Darby disappeared during a late-night shift at her convenience store in Max Creek. Prior to vanishing, she had called her son and told him that a suspicious-looking man was loitering outside. When her son arrived to check on her just 10 minutes later, Trudy was nowhere to be found. Her body was discovered 2 days later, submerged in the Little Niangua River. 2 shotgun blasts had decimated the back of her head. Just 1 month later, on the 28th of February, 30-year-old Cheryl Ann Kenny disappeared after locking up a convenience store in Nevada, Missouri. Her vehicle was found in the car park, but just like Angie, her whereabouts and well-being remain a mystery to this day. In 1994, half-brothers Jesse Rush and Marvin Chaney were found guilty of slaying Trudy Darby. For a while, they were the prime suspects in Angie's case as well, particularly because Rush had alluded to taking the lives of other women. In a letter, he wrote, "I'm glad they don't know everything else we did, or I'd be on death row." In recent years, however, for reasons that have never been disclosed, the authorities have determined that the 2 half-brothers weren't involved in Angie's disappearance. Several other suspects have also been investigated over the past 3 decades, but none have ever been charged. On the 30th anniversary of Angie's disappearance, in April 2021, Clinton PD announced a new theory: that Angie had been the victim of mistaken identity. Back in 1991, a man known only as Mr. A was acting as an informant in a high-profile narcotics case. On April 4th of that year, the exact same day that Angie went missing, Mr. A received an anonymous letter in the post, which had been made using cutouts from magazines. The note threatened the life of his daughter, a young woman also named Angie, who also happened to live in Clinton, and who bore a striking resemblance to Angela Hammond. Referring to Mr. A by his court number, the letter read as follows: Hello number. People like you deserve what they get. We know where your foxy daughter's at. She will see us soon. Tell your wife she has our deepest sympathy in her further loss. Goodbye. Investigators have since revealed that an anonymous caller contacted them, claiming to have information about Angela's case, and apparently mentioning details about the cut-and-paste letter which hadn't been revealed to the public. They're hopeful that this caller will one day contact them again. 1 month after this new lead was revealed, in May 2021, Angie's mother passed away without ever finding out what fate befell her daughter and unborn grandchild. To this day, Rob Schaefer is haunted by the events of April 4th, 1991. The image of watching the perp's vehicle get further and further away, with him powerless to do anything, is one that will never leave his mind.
The beginning's the hardest. Because you know you were close enough to get him. But you just didn't get the job done.
2 months after Angie was taken, Rob joined the National Guard. He's now in his early 50s and has a family of his own, but still maintains contact with Angie's living relatives. They all hold out hope that one day her case will be marked as resolved on the Charley Project. In 1999, Paul Skiba was a 38-year-old business owner and father. After a messy divorce with his ex-wife, Michelle, Paul had agreed to a shared custody agreement in which his daughter, Sarah, would spend every other weekend with him at his home in Thornton, Colorado. There, Paul lived with his on and off girlfriend, Teresa Donovan, a woman who had just given birth to a son. She claimed that the baby was Paul's, but he had his doubts. After all, it wasn't unheard of for Paul to come home from work and find that Teresa was next door, partying with the neighbour. This late-night partying continued even after the baby was born, and Paul would sometimes return and find that his daughter, Sarah, was taking care of the newborn, while Teresa was out and about who knows where. Paul confided in his closest friends that he planned to kick Teresa out of the house, but before he did so, he needed to have a paternity test conducted. If the baby truly was his, he was planning to sue Teresa for full custody. On the morning of Sunday, February 7th, Paul took his 9-year-old daughter Sarah along with him to work. Paul ran a moving company, Tough Movers, and he figured that for Sarah, a day at the store with her father was better than a day spent with Teresa. The pair drove to the store in Westminster, where they met up with Paul's employee, Lorenzo Chivers. At 5:30 p.m, a moving job was scheduled, and all three of them hopped into one of Paul's large moving trucks and set out to the client's house. They were last seen at approximately 6 p.m. in Morrison. Later that evening, Teresa called Paul's mother, Sharon, and informed her that Paul and Sarah hadn't returned home. Teresa, Sharon, and Sarah's mother, Michelle, all placed separate calls to the authorities and filed missing persons reports. The following day, one of Paul's employees, Jerry Bybee, arrived for work at Tough Movers. He noticed that one of the trucks in the lot had been parked in an irregular fashion, front first and crooked. Paul was a neat freak, recalled Jerry Bybee. So I'm thinking, oh, I can't wait to hear why the truck's parked like that, because Paul would have a story. Realizing that his boss wasn't inside the store, Bybee went to inspect the poorly parked truck. To his surprise though, the lock on the front gate to the lot had been changed. When neither Paul nor Lorenzo showed up for work that day, Bybee called the police. On February 11th, 3 days after they had gone missing, an officer finally showed up at Tough Movers to investigate. He meandered through the parking lot, half-heartedly looking around the area, and even stepped in a suspicious puddle of oil on the ground. According to Jerry Bybee, who was showing him around, the officer, quote, destroyed more evidence than he was willing to look at. That same afternoon, a close friend of Paul's, Rich Lesmeister, learned that his pal had gone missing and decided to take matters into his own hands. Both he and his wife climbed the fence to the store's parking lot and inspected the misparked truck for themselves. To their horror, they found bullet holes in the side of the vehicle. There was also a noticeable blood smear running along the exterior. Inside the van, right by the windshield, they found a piece of a human scalp, along with multiple clumps of hair. A DNA test revealed that the portion of scalp belonged to Paul, and that the hair belonged to both him and his daughter, Sarah. No physical matter belonging to Lorenzo was found anywhere inside the vehicle. Despite the fact that a worryingly large piece of Paul's scalp was found in the truck, detectives initially theorized that the whole scene had been staged, and that the newly divorced father had run away with his daughter, Sarah. Lorenzo, they figured, was an accomplice. However, they soon realized that the amount of blood in the van suggested something more sinister had happened. Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo were almost certainly dead. Several of the lakes around Denver were searched, but the bodies of the 3 victims have never been found. In the eyes of the investigators, Paul was likely the intended target, with Sarah and Lorenzo simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their moving truck had probably been ambushed when they returned it to the lot, and was then used to transport their remains. One thing the investigators noted was that the truck's 3x10-foot loading ramp was missing from the vehicle, as were the straps and moving blankets. Those missing items seemed to suggest that the victims had been strapped to the ramp like a stretcher and dumped in some unknown location. But what could have possibly been the motive in this case? Why would somebody want Paul out of the picture? Well, several articles have suggested a possible reason. As mentioned, Paul was planning to have a paternity test conducted to determine whether the son he was raising with Teresa was truly his. After Paul's disappearance and presumed demise, Teresa sued Paul's mother Sharon for all of his assets. In her words, Paul would have wanted his son to have everything, especially since his daughter Sarah was now gone too. In response, Sharon asked to have a DNA test performed on the baby. That way she'd know if he really was Paul's son. Teresa refused. It also came to light that Teresa's brother, Tom Donovan, was a former employee of Paul's, but wound up being fired by him shortly before this whole incident took place. Tom went on to say that he was glad Paul was dead, and that he wanted to shoot Paul's mother too. To make this web of connections even more complex, Teresa and Tom's sister, Bobby Jo Donovan, was also dating Lorenzo. They lived together with Lorenzo's son, Josh. On the night Lorenzo failed to return home from work, Josh called up his grandma and said that he was worried about his dad. Bobby Jo took the phone from him and told the grandmother that, quote, something terrible had happened to Lorenzo and he wasn't coming back. Josh went to stay with his grandma for a while. When they returned a few days later, they found that Bobby Jo had packed up all of Josh's belongings and left them by the door. She was kicking him out the house. Did Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo meet their ends at the hands of the Donovan siblings? Were the 3 of them after Paul's assets, or was Paul targeted for another reason entirely? Since no leads have ever been seriously pursued in this case, likely because of police incompetence, we'll probably never know for sure. But many people have their suspicions. As for the 3 missing persons, they remain unaccounted for, and nobody has ever been charged in connection with their disappearances. In 1998, 40-year-old Diane Augat was living in the sunny city of Odessa, Florida. Although a native New Yorker, she had moved to the Sunshine State years prior to be closer to her family who had settled there. It didn't take long for Diane to carve out a life for herself in Florida too. There, she met Frederick, her future husband. The couple had 3 children together, whom she doted over. That is, until Diane's mental health took a sudden and drastic turn for the worse in the late 80s. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which only worsened over time. Her unpredictable episodes took a toll on all of her relationships. and by 1991, her marriage collapsed, with Frederick taking full custody of their kids. This led to Diane self-medicating with booze and other substances. Over the next few years, her life continued to unravel. She fell in with a rough crowd, began committing minor offences, and eventually was sectioned in a mental health facility against her will. Following her release from the institution, Diane moved in with her sister, Deborah, in nearby Hudson. But just 2 weeks later, Diane vanished from the face of the earth entirely. Which brings us neatly to her entry on the Charley project. Diane disappeared on April 10th, 1998. That morning, her sister Deborah went to a doctor's appointment. When she returned, Diane was gone. It's believed that she left the apartment at approximately 11 AM. Unable to contact her, Diane's mother reported her missing on April 11th, terrified that her daughter had gotten into some kind of trouble. The same day the missing persons report was filed, the bartender at the nearby Hayloft Tavern reported that Diane had come in for a few drinks, but that he had to cut her off after she started walking in circles. Afterwards, a motorist reported seeing Diane walking north on US Route 19, very close to New York Avenue. That was sometime between 3 and 4 PM. Those were the final confirmed sightings of her. An unconfirmed sighting was also reported at the Coral Sands Motel, only half a kilometre from New York Avenue. Detectives tried to track Diane down along US 19, but couldn't find a trace of her anywhere. 3 days later, on April 14th, somebody made a call to Diane's mother. Nobody was at home at the time, but the caller left a message. When Diane's mother returned, she listened to the voicemail that had been left for her, and the words that poured out of the machine would haunt her for decades. "Help! Help! Let me out!" The voice was unmistakably Diane's, terrified and shrill. Her plea was interrupted by the sound of rustling, as if someone was wresting the phone from her grasp. A second voice could be heard screaming, "Hey, give me that," before the message abruptly ended. Diane's mother tried returning the call, but nobody picked up. After checking the caller ID, investigators learned that the call had come from a place listed as Starlight. The exact location of Starlight has never been uncovered, or at least never disclosed by the authorities, though a few businesses with that name have been identified near Odessa. That includes the Starlight Lounge, now called Teasers, a gentleman's club in Tampa that was known to have a dodgy clientele. It was used as a hunting ground by serial killer Bobby Joe Long back in the 80s. There was also the Starlight Barbershop in Largo and a Starlight Ballroom in Clearwater. Others have theorized that the call may have been placed from the Starlight Motel in Port Richey, and that Diane had been taken there by people she knew. What happened to her after she placed that call remains a mystery. The same day that the voicemail was left, a local woman was walking along US 19 when she came across a, quote, joke finger resting on the roadside. Thinking that was odd, she later mentioned it to her boyfriend. The following day, he drove out to take a look at the object himself. He found it lying right where his girlfriend said it would be, though upon closer inspection, his worst fears were confirmed. His girlfriend hadn't found a joke finger after all. It was the real middle finger of a human being, severed at the first knuckle. A DNA analysis confirmed that the body part did indeed belong to Diane. It's the only piece of her that's ever been found. Experts determined that the appendage hadn't been removed cleanly and may have been detached after being slammed in a car door. It's unknown whether it was left by the roadside deliberately or not. However, the location where it was found raised two possibilities. That Diane was forced into a vehicle as she walked US 19, and that she lost her finger as the door was slammed shut. Or that her finger was removed at some point thereafter, perhaps as punishment for making her desperate final phone call, and was then discarded along the same road she had last been seen. Later that week, on April 18th, Diane's home in Odessa was looted. It's unknown whether this was related to her disappearance, or if it was a mere coincidence. That same day though, the manager of the totally convenience store in Odessa opened up one of the outdoor freezers behind the building. Inside, she found a pile of neatly folded clothes. Since the manager knew who Diane was, she immediately recognized that the clothes belonged to her. This was quickly confirmed by Diane's sister, Deborah. According to the manager, she had last inspected the freezers 3 weeks prior, and as such, the clothes could have been placed inside at any point since then. Why they had been left at a store that Diane frequented and not destroyed remains unclear, but it seemed as if whoever had left them there wanted them to be found. Following the discovery of Diane's clothes, the case seemingly hit a dead end, and the media stopped reporting on it completely. It appeared as if it were destined to go cold. But with this being Florida, one should always expect the unexpected. On November 25th, 2000, more than 2.5 years after Diane disappeared, and just one day after a local newspaper ran a story on her case, there was a surprising development. A customer at a Circle K in Pasco, Florida, found a clear, Ziploc bag at the store's lottery counter. On it, in black, permanent marker, someone had written, Diane. That customer just so happened to be the girlfriend of Diane's brother. After opening the bag, detectives found black eyeliner, pink lipstick, Taboo perfume, and a tube of generic brand toothpaste. The items were all brands that Diane frequently purchased, and the toothpaste was the same kind provided by her mental health facility. And yet, despite checking through the store surveillance footage, no meaningful leads presented themselves. It's unknown who left the bag at the store, or why, but given that it was discovered by a close contact of Diane's the day after a front-page story of her ran in the local paper, some speculate that it may have been left there by her family, a way for them to reignite the search for their missing relative. So let's talk suspects. Well, this won't take long. The only suspect to ever be publicly named was 52-year-old Gary Evers, the co-manager of the Coral Sands Motel, the location of Diane's final unconfirmed sighting. The authorities have never announced why exactly they considered him a person of interest. He didn't have a record at the time of Diane's vanishing. However, on June 27th, 2000, 2 masked individuals tried to rob the Coral Sands Motel. One of them struck Gary's girlfriend in the face. In a fit of rage, Gary Evers later confronted one of the men who he thought was responsible, a man called Todd Kramers. With his trusty 9mm in hand, and in front of a group of witnesses, Gary unloaded 2 clips into Todd's face. As it would turn out, Todd was innocent. Gary was sentenced to life behind bars for Todd's murder, and he passed away in prison in 2012. He was never officially charged in connection with Diane's disappearance. Possible links have since been made between Diane's case and that of 2 other missing women in the Pasco County area, Rhonda Ann Brown in January 2000 and Kathleen Wanda Hesega in October 2002. All 3 women were heavy drinkers, and all 3 women were last seen walking along the roadside. It's unknown whether they all fell victim to the same unidentified killer or not. But then again, there are a plethora of unanswered questions related to this case. We can only hope that in the near future, Diane's family are given the closure that they so desperately crave, and that her page on the Charley Project can finally be marked resolved. So, those were just a handful of pages from the Charley Project. If you browse through the site long enough though, you'll notice just how ordinary most of these missing people are. Normal, unassuming folks who all woke up one morning completely unaware that that day they were about to vanish from the face of the earth. Sure, some of these people made a few bad decisions, but the majority were just going about their business. It's worrying to think that any one of us could, one day, have our own entry on the project. But even more horrible is the thought that for every person catalogued, there's probably someone out there who knows what happened to them, It makes you wonder how many sinister individuals walk among us, and how many of them we may have passed in the street, unaware of who they are and what they've done. A huge thank you to my top tier members on YouTube and Patreon: SonicLeonNarcotic, PeytonTrolling, Itai Alon, Nefus 1988, Lydia Ciummo, Alex Greensall, Asia Mina, Asriel Warakai, Brad Hammer 33, Chief Kochwake, Colin Monsma, Connor Louthan, Dustin and Tiffany Vanderpool, Gina Valera, Hamish, Ian Biluck, Infamous Sempapi, Jesse Jug, Leonardo Martinez, Monica Mendoza, Mrs. Yvonne Rankin, Peter Lulgjuraj, Philip Westre, Taylor&Monica Gruenke, TheOnlyDorita, TnSMOM, and Xane.